The topic of digital-only releases is one that is pushed into the spotlight with more and more frequency. For some, it is due to long-awaited sequels they care for, labeling a physical trail as a hindrance in the sequel's development. For others, it is due to the lack of ownership that comes from newer media, highlighting the importance of preservation. And there's even a vocal group that simply has strong nostalgic ties to physical media. But at the end of the day, the conversation of the future of gaming media concerns us all. Since this is such an important subject, it should be treated with sincerity and very direct statements, a practice that rarely seems to be the norm in modern marketing and game journalism. So let's put our cards on the table. What the title of this video refers to is that the proposed premise of digital only being the natural evolution of games as a medium is one that wasn't chosen by its consumers, but one that was pushed on them. While it's true that a portion of the market will always value convenience above all else, claiming that the entirety of the market willingly abides by this premise is short-sighted at best and maliciously deceptive at worst. Even if your one and only goal as a business is to maximize your profit, it's clear that neglecting the vocally expressed needs of your consumers for physical media is ultimately damaging both sides of the exchange. Consumers are losing a highly desired type of product, and companies are outright rejecting an incredibly valuable revenue stream. The fact that companies like limited-run games are flourishing, even in a time where physical games are still very much around, is a testament to that. More importantly than that, the role physical media plays in the industry's ecosystem is one that is intrinsically entangled with many points of interest, from sheer profit, to effective development cycles, to attempts at legal game preservation. And because of its almost multidisciplinary nature, the debate on physical media's current necessity has also led to excessive misinformation being circulated through news outlets. But why? After all, isn't the core logic behind digital media that of a more cost-effective, more accessible way of enjoying art? And in turn, something that should be seen as a pro-consumer initiative? In theory, yes. But the issue arises when you implement that premise into a business setting. No matter how many resources you have at your disposal, the premise behind economics as a whole will always be to get the most benefit with the least investment. And physical media is only one of the relevant variables here. See, from the perspective of a company, cutting off physical media would, in the short term, mean you don't need to invest money into printing cases, which would in turn allow for more resources to be invested into the actual core development, among other things. Not only that, but this could also make way for tangential benefits in the form of a longer development cycle being allowed, now that there is no additional deadline present, and it even has the potential of generating more revenue early on, due to digital media being less prone to rapid price decreases. So if a company sees eliminating physical media as a win-win for them, they will present it as a win-win for everyone. And that's the message that will be reiterated through relevant news outlets. But this premise, even from a purely business-centered standpoint, is inherently flawed and short-sighted. Because with development costs increasing further and further, you can't risk losing a valuable revenue stream if you want to stay in business in the long run. So then, why do companies insist on digital-only being the way to go? Well, it's a way of temporarily avoiding a bigger problem with modern game development. Like I've said earlier, economics are always about getting more from less. So now that you've cut out one variable from the process, any businessman that considers themselves savvy in the field will find even more ways of increasing the perceived efficiency, 'cause you can never have too much money in the end. So, you don't have to finish working on the game code early to meet a deadline for the physical print? Great! That means you have more time to input countless features into the game so that our marketing team could add shiny taglines like over 200 hours of compelling gameplay, 10,000 unique questlines and collectibles, a game that feels like an Emmy Award-winning show in motion. And if these demands seem outrageous for you ground floor developers, don't worry. Crunch culture and a day one patch will surely fix everything. It will all come together in the end. This is a very tongue-in-cheek premise, mind you, but it's sadly very close to how game development tends to be in the AAA sphere. And what it boils down to is that the removal of a quote-unquote limitation in the cycle isn't used to perfect the work you've already done, but rather to add more stuff in, because the industry is still so hung up on the belief that bigger always means better, and therefore believe it will lead to more profit. What's more is that the majority of a game's lifetime sales will occur early on in its lifespan, meaning that a good first impression will be more valuable to the company than long-time support of a title. So companies are in a state of throwing as much money and people into the process as possible, in hopes of having a product that immediately wows reviewers and in turn leads to greater sales projections and admirable first week sales. But this also means that anything beyond that point in the cycle will largely be considered irrelevant, unless it relates to a microtransaction model that was implemented. Hell, post-launch patches are frequently used as damage control if your community is really angry with the product, whereas back in the day, when you had no patches, you had to properly execute your vision immediately as best you could. Since you had a clear deadline and limits to your work, you had to cut unnecessary features and focus on making the best core experience you could right out the gate, without the safety net of a post-launch patch. Nowadays, we've been conditioned to expect a game being glitched to oblivion on release, and this doesn't change between digital-only games and those that have a physical release, no matter what a company may lead you to believe. Crunch is almost always present, because ground floor developers physically can't handle the increased workload when management refuses to properly allocate resources and scale down when necessary. We as consumers won't see an increase in quality from a removal of physical media, because physical media isn't the issue plaguing game development. The thing hindering these development cycles isn't the cost of printing discs, it's the inadequate resource management exhibited while chasing trends in gaming that are not sustainable. So let's get back to the initial statement. If you look at this matter from a developer standpoint, we already know that this is not the case. Development costs have only increased, and the only thing that has changed in terms of profitability is the current focus on short-term returns over long-term ones. And as we'll see later on in the video, this is basically a band-aid over a bullet hole. If you look at this premise from a consumer standpoint, it's even more ridiculous, because digital versions of games are, again, less prone to rapid price decreases, and the games themselves aren't getting better on launch solely from a lack of a physical release. If anything, this practice is only pushing more people into using subscription services, which raises an even bigger issue that I'll get into some other time. So, how do we fix all of this? It's actually simpler than you might imagine. Digital and physical aren't meant to be alternatives to one another. Instead, they're meant to complement one another. When you accept the fact that companies are fundamentally driven by profit, and that consumers are driven by the satisfaction of their specific needs, you need to find an actual state of win-win. Pretending that the market doesn't want physical media anymore isn't working out, and I need only point at the revenue generated by companies like Limited Run to prove it. As abhorrent as their business practices may be from an objective standpoint, the existence and success of such a service is essentially a direct response to the steady push of the game industry trying to go the old digital route, whatever reasoning they may present as the cause for it. In reality, no one is preventing you from printing physical copies after a game is good and patched. Hell, it could even be an actual cost-effective way to validate the project to your investors in the long run, because you can see that consumers are ready and willing to support their favorite franchises in such a way. There are fans who will purchase multiple copies of the same game just to have all of the different versions in their collection, because that's the kind of positive impact your product had on them. Even when you're selling a collector's edition filled with shiny trinkets that don't include the actual game, such releases will still sell out in minutes, if not seconds. But if you think LRG was a poor example, then have a look at Square Enix instead. They have a whole segment of their page dedicated to selling reprints of their older games. No need to invest excessive resources into remasters and remakes. You can literally have a made-to-order system in place, so that you as a publisher know how many copies can be sold, and you'll earn money with minimal effort for a project you've already finished decades ago. For as money-hungry as some game publishers tend to be, I find it astonishing how, when you have a way of generating income that also benefits your supporters in a meaningful way, very few opt for that solution. And the end result is that if these supporters can't find the service they seek from the company that should offer it, then they'll look elsewhere, which in turn leads to a secondary market in a state of hyperinflation. This is the most extreme way of telling you that physical media isn't going away. You may label this as a matter of the biological nature of human beings seeking physical representations of the things that bring them joy, but at the end of the day, we want these products and we're willing to pay for them, as opposed to just pirating everything. And there's even more to it than that. In an attempt to circumvent the larger problem of game preservation, many companies have opted to make remasters and remakes of their most notable titles, as opposed to making the originals playable on modern systems. And while there are certainly some great examples of these new releases doing their job, it's not a foolproof process. Even when it comes to remakes that receive near universal acclaim, there will still be segments from the original that had to be largely altered or completely removed, meaning that the only way to fully experience these intricacies for yourself would be to actually play the original game. You might be curious as to how the matter of remakes relates to physical releases specifically, and that's a great question. As much as we may fault game developers for making unnecessary remakes, there are instances where they have no other viable way of making the essence of those older games available today. I'm sure we all know about the Silent Hill HD collection debacle. Essentially, Konami employed a studio with no prior experience in remastering games and had them work with incomplete builds of the games that were to be remastered. As ridiculous as this may sound, many Japanese companies had the tendency of scrapping the final builds of their projects, presumably because no one thought that these games would have to be remastered down the line. But as we've seen with the 7th console generation, it was a viable business strategy. While it could be possible to remaster these games in a way that's really close to the originals, assuming enough time and money was allocated to the right team, there's a great chance that some of the atmospheric bits we loved so much in the originals were just accidental discoveries that couldn't be deliberately replicated. If you think that's too far-fetched, I'd like to point to such a case in Devil May Cry 4, a game that accidentally left in a bug that was later treated as its own mechanic by the community. This bug was not, or more than likely could not, be so easily replicated, and was thus absent from Devil May Cry 5. But it did remain in the remaster of the former game, cause there was no need to remove a bug-turned-feature with such vocal acclaim. So when you take into account these technical or logistical limitations, this means that through legitimate means, your most viable course of action would still be to seek out a physical copy of your favorite game, cause that's the only guarantee that you'll actually have that original experience you seek. Even in the instances where games have been adequately remastered and made available digitally, they could just as easily be removed due to licensing issues, meaning that you're once again back to square one. And since I've already alluded to the biggest problem tied to a digital-only future, let's finally address the big topic. I'm sure we've all seen this article by now, and as sad as it may be, it didn't really surprise many of us. The industry is so focused on making more content that they haven't stopped to think about long-term preservation. Now, an argument can be made that physical releases do not fully equate to game preservation, as discs and cartridges, much like their associated consoles, are prone to breaking with time. Though, when you consider that even some games that at one point had a digital presence are now absent due to the aforementioned problems like licensing issues, you have to wonder which of these options is actually a more long-term solution, based on past experiences. eShops have closed in the past and will continue to do so in the future. Many games that were digital only are seemingly treated as if they've never even existed in the eyes of the general gaming community. Yet, because of that human tendency to collect things, there are still fully sealed copies of some classic games being put up for auction all across the secondary market. The prices are absolutely despicable, yet the games are still technically available, for better or worse. But let's look at the issue from a different perspective. As you'll recall, I've already mentioned the concept of patch culture earlier in the video. While it's true that patches can result in a better experience of a game down the line, it also means that the original iteration of the game that was released will only be accessible to you if you purchase the physical copy and you just refuse to update it. Contrary to popular belief, even the most quote-unquote broken games are still playable from start to finish on release. They legally couldn't be printed if that wasn't the case. So a speedrunner, for example, would look more favorably at that unpatched version due to the multitude of openings it could offer for them to creatively deconstruct the game. Or perhaps there's an exploit that you as a casual consumer enjoy because it makes the game easier. But you can eventually wind up losing it in the future patch because developers didn't intend for that mishap to be present at all. Ironically enough, a physical copy allows for game preservation of a completely different kind today, as a result of the changes in the industry. These imperfect builds have the same value as alpha or beta builds from back in the day, just larger in scale. Yet we run the risk of losing them just the same as fully functioning games that were polished to perfection, if the industry truly keeps doubling down on this refusal for physical media. Between companies pushing for digital-only releases, the secondary market taking advantage of the physical media still in circulation, and the gaming community's interests being disregarded by both, you'll ultimately find yourself in a state where more and more people will turn to piracy. Not because they want to, but because it's the only way of keeping the memory of these games alive. And so we're stuck in a perpetual cycle of one negligence giving birth to another. I do not condone piracy. I believe that a grand portion of people don't, and have only ever tried it because it was the lesser evil in this conundrum. But the problems tied to it are ones that can actually be solved, or at the very least, extremely minimized. I've seen this quote so many times, but it keeps getting more and more relevant as time goes on. If you as a company strive to offer convenience above all else, as you've stated in trying to justify going digital only, then you can't just cherry-pick what works for you. Because for many of us, it's inconvenient to have to do this whole song and dance just to play your product in a way that actually benefits us both. I understand why people want physical games to stay, even from a purely nostalgic level, as with the increase in sheer volume, it becomes harder and harder to latch onto the experiences from a single game, when all you'll have to remember it by down the line will likely be a few trophy icons on your profile. These boxes aren't just random plastic. They're a form of tangible heritage that carries a genuine story with it. A story that will remain even when all the online servers for our favorite consoles have long shut down. This isn't just a legacy of one company or one industry. This is a legacy that we have all built, companies and consumers alike, and I don't want it to fade with time. The point of this video isn't that physical is good and digital is bad. The point is that we're all collectively dealing with a problem, and looking away isn't going to fix it. With that, I would like to conclude this video. To clarify, this wasn't aimed specifically at RGG Studio. I do believe that the uncertainty of Gaiden's physical release in the West is a problem, But the reason behind Yakuza footage being heavily featured here is more so for convenience, considering that it's the easiest footage for me to capture. In fact, RGG was actually shown to be a great example of preservation being done right over the years, regardless of the split opinions on releases like Ishin Kiwami. Nevertheless, I hope we will get a good conversation going from this video, as always, and I will try to make the next one more uplifting cause this topic was way too serious in retrospect, but it was important, so thank you for being here. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!